everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from October 15th, 2021. I'm recording this on April 14th, 2022. I give those dates so you know when this information is actually relevant because the comic market is always moving and changing. We're also, as always, looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week. This week we got 19 books to look back at. We used those two lists to kind of see what was hot back then and to see how they've performed since, what factors made them hot, what factors have affected them since. So we all make a little bit better decisions about the hot books that we chase. And if you've been watching this list at all lately, you know that you shouldn't be chasing hardly any of them, as because most of them are down or at the worst steady if you'd been patient. So we got 19 books to talk about. So let's get into this list and see if we can learn anything this week. First up, we have Misfit City #1 from 2017. This hit the list because an HBO show was announced of this cross between Goonies and Stranger Things is the way they described it. This caused raw copies of this book to jump all the way to $50. Now it's a $10 to $20 book. So it definitely turned into a trap. This is not unusual for these option books to drop way back. If as you know, if you're watching this list, they get optioned and then there's just no news for a really long time. Or in this case, it wasn't optioned, but the show was announced. But again, there's just no necessarily movement, no casting, no production yet. So this show has, think about how long they've been working on that Green Lantern show for HBO. It just takes a long time to make these shows. And that is why this book is dropped way back. Next, we have Youngblood #2 on the list for the second week in a row. The first appearance of Prophet hit the list because Jake Gyllenhaal was attached to the movie production, which caused this to jump up to a $10 to $25 book back then. 9.8s were going for $300 to $400. Which made no sense to me back then. There's literally 5 billion of these out there. Raw copies are now 5 to 15. 9.8 will cost you 100 to 150. Another book that turned into a massive trap. Marginally a dumpster fire, really, on that 9.8 side. Yeah, if you paid $400 for 9.8 of this book, I'm sorry. But I feel like this is when you really should have realized it's probably not going to hold. Next, we're going to move into covers. Our first cover this week is one that was on the list last week, and that is Department of Truth #13, the Jordan Hoven NYCC variant. Last week we were talking about it being a $100 book, and we said it was pretty steady. This week it's this week it was $180 plus for this cover. And now it's an $80 to $120 book. 9.8 will only cost you $2 to $250. So another book that turned into a trap from the peak. That first week, if you bought it the first week, you would have done okay. But if you waited this long, you definitely did not do okay and should have just been patient longer. Our next cover is Gun Honey #1. This Warren Lau variant, which was limited to 500 copies. Back then was going for $175 to $200 for a raw copy. Now it's $100 to $200 book for a raw copy. A 9.8 will go $325 to $375. I thought for sure this one would be a bit of a trap. I haven't really heard anything about the story, but these covers for this book have continued to sell pretty well. I mean, I personally don't know that this one's that great, but people wanted it, people bought it, or still buying it. So this one's been pretty steady, all things considered, over the last 6 months. You could definitely get a deal compared to some of those prices then, but it's overall been pretty steady and still in a similar range. Our next cover is Philadelphia #12, the Todd McFarlane variant. This book jumped up to $35 to $40 at this point, after having been sitting right after release at 10 to 20. So it jumped up just because McFarland. Now it's a $15 to $30 book. There's been the most recent 9.8 sale was only for $70, whereas the two most recent 9.6 sales have been for $90. It's a little weird, but not a lot of 9.8s or 9.6 that, for that matter, out there. But this definitely turned into an I'll be back on the raw side, and a book that you could do better if you'd just been patient. Next, we're going to move into out of covers, into a little bit of comic buzz. And first up, we have We Live #1. This hit the list because it was nominated for an Eisner. There's been a lot of buzz just about how good the series was. Back then, raw copies were up to $25. 9.8 was hitting around $120. Now, raw copies are $30 to $40. 9.8 hitting $70 to $100. So, raw copies are up, 9.8s are down slightly. Overall, I put this as steady and worth it because there's actually similar number of sales of raw and slabs of this A cover of this book recently. A lot of people have gotten this book slab. There have been quite a few sales. So overall, I just kind of put it as worth it. Is a book that, yeah, it's sitting in the same range. Maybe you could have done a little better if you'd been patient on 9.8, but you might have done a little worse if you were patient on a raw copy. So another book, though, that's sitting just kind of right in the similar range as where it was then. Next, we have Superman, Son of Kal-El, #2. The first appearance of Jay Nakamura, which is the kid that is John's boyfriend in the comics. Back then, raw copies of this book jumped up to $15 to $20 when this was kind of revealed that this was coming. Now it's a $5 to $20 book. 9.8s are only going for like $35, $50. So this one is definitely backed up quite a bit. Did not really, I predicted it would follow kind of a similar pattern to what was going on with Urban Legends, the book with Tim Drake and stuff, and it really hasn't. This one is backed up a little more. It's definitely down and then I'll be back. I think you could say that too about the Urban Legends book, but this one I feel like it's backed up a little more severely than that one did. So yeah. Next, we have Convergence, Superman #2 with John in the News. His first appearance as a baby hit the list. Raw copies back then were going for $40. Now it's a $15 to $40 book. You're still we'll see an occasional sale up around that $40, but you can get it for quite a bit cheaper as well. 9.8s on this one run $175 to $300, pretty wide range on a 9.8 sale. Overall, this is another kind of I'll be back book. I thought this one might hold or do better just because I've kind of thought his first appearance was a little bit undervalued, but so far hasn't really caught on despite him being the current Superman. That it's still setting pretty low. I think maybe people would rather have the when he's a kid, actually, and I forget which issue that is now. I'm blanking on that, but the book that comes later when he's not a baby but actually a kid, maybe that's the one people would rather have. Don't know. Next, we have Brightest Day #4, the first appearance of Jackson Hyde, the second Aqualad, also the son of Black Manta, which is kind of a variation of the kid we see in Young Justice. This was going for $15 for raw copies back then because he was mentioned in a fandom tweet. Don't remember what that was about, but this book is actually up. It's our one up book of the week. Spoilers. It's now a $25 to $40 book on the raw side. 9.8s are hitting around $175. So people are still interested in Jackson Hyde, and this book has actually done better over the last now than it was 6 months ago. With that's 9 books. The rest of the list, except for one, are all MCU related. So we got 9 MCU books coming up. First up is Avengers #257 on the list for second time in 3 weeks, I think. The first appearance of Nebula. Back then, 9.8 hit 600 plus, and 9.6 was 350. With the news that she was going to be one of the main focuses of Guardians 3. Now raw copies are 20 to 70 with a 9.8 sitting 350 to 500. Again, pretty wide range on those 9.8 sales. But another book that's down and then I'll be back. We're still a year or so away from Guardians 3, I think. So even though James Gunn recently said they kind of wrapped initial filming, we're still a ways out from the actual movie coming out. So yeah, this book is definitely kind of taking a step back. Amazing. Still kind of surprising to me that how little love this book gets compared to some of the other books for characters that haven't even appeared yet as many times as we've seen Nebula. But next we have Bloodstone #1. Speaking of a character we haven't seen yet that gets a lot more love. The first appearance of Elsa Bloodstone. Raw copies of this back then were up to $350. 9.8s were over 800, with fresh rumors that this character was going to appear in some form coming soon. Now raw copies will cost you $125 to $400. A 9.8 will cost you $700 to $1,000. So this has also been pretty steady, kind of worth it particularly on the slab side. And even a little bit on the raw side, is because most of the sales are in that $300 to $400 range, but you can occasionally find copies, again, condition and so forth, for less, even higher grade ones. So just got to be patient, keep looking there on the raw side. With that, our next MCU books, next couple, are related to the announcement that we were getting House of Harkness, that Agatha Harkness was coming back. Catherine Hahn's character from WandaVision. Back then, that announcement caused Fantastic Four number 94, her first appearance, to jump back up. The book had dropped way back after WandaVision had come and gone, but it jumped back up with this announcement. Raw copies were, according to them, averaging around $600 now, and now they're $50 to $300 for raw copies. So those have backed up considerably. 9.4, did go for $1,500 back then, which is what the most recent 9.4 went for. But again, there's very, very few sales of that high a grade. Most grades have backed up a little bit since the fall announcement. So this has definitely turned into an I'll be back overall. Borderline trap on the raw side, really. Next, we have Fantastic Four number 185. This is the first appearance of Nicholas Scratch, who is Agatha's son. So given House of Harkness, people were thinking we might get this character. Again, we're a long way from getting this show, but raw copies of this jumped up to an average of $50. 9.8 hit $400. Now it's a $5 to $30 book on the raw side. No recent high grade sales on the slab side. Definitely a book that has turned into a trap. We may still get this character, but it's just going to be a long time before we get any official word on this show. So yeah, there's just demonstrates no need to rush out and buy when you get the announcement. Be patient, look for a little bit of a deal there. The other big announcement from Marvel that came around this time was that we got casting for Adam Warlock. Back then, Fantastic Four number 66, the origin of him, even though he's not actually seen in the book. Raw copies of this were going for $500, and 9.8 went for $20,400, which is just, whoa. Now raw copies though are running about $40 to $300, pretty wide range, but even the higher grades ones are around $300. It's definitely backed up on the raw side. 9.2 is the highest kind of recent sale, and I looked through a couple different things. Hasn't really been any high grade 9.8s, 9.6s, or 9.4s sold in the last 4 or 5 months. 9.2 is kind of the highest grade to compare to. It went for $2,000. I don't know that really tells you something. So you really just have to look at those raw sales. And from that, it definitely appears like it's an I'll be back. Again, we're still a ways from Guardians 3. So I'm sure this book will jump once we get closer or we get him in the trailer. Next, we have Fantastic Four number 67, the first cameo and a continuation of the origin of him. So we actually do get a cameo with him in the cocoon in this one, and I think maybe him out of the cocoon. I forget exactly the details on how this introduction of him goes, but I think he's like briefly out of the cocoon, but you don't really see him or something. I forget. Anyway, this one, 7.5 was hitting $850 to $1,000 for this book. A 4.0 went for $315. Now a 7.5 will cost you $600 to $850. Raw copies are running $50 to $1,200 on recent sales, depending on condition. So really wide range, obviously, there, just based completely on grade. So super high grade stuff will cost you over $1,000 on this. Obviously, this is kind of the big book for Adam Warlock, maybe even more so than the one we're about to talk about. But it's still an I'll be back over the last 6 months, just as we've been waiting for between the initial announcement and actually getting to see him or getting any kind of trailer or anything from Guardians 3, which could be a long time, seeing as we still don't have a Thor trailer. Speaking of which, the next book is Thor 165. More him-related stuff. This is the first full appearance of him outside the cocoon. Raw copies of this were going for $2,400. 9.0 went for $5,500. This one is backed up a lot. Raw copies now are $200 to $1,500, which is still high grade ones, still big money for high grade raw. But a most recent 9.0 sale is $26.50, so about half of what it was then. So this one definitely turned into a bit of a trap on kind of the raw and slab side. It is definitely backed up. Again, we're just in that big lull between the initial news and actually getting this book, or actually getting to see this character. Next, more Adam Warlock related stuff. This is Marvel Premiere #1. This is the rebirth of him as Adam Warlock. Raw copies of this were averaging a little over $500 back then. A 9.6 went for $2,400. 9.6 still sitting around $2,500. But the raw copies are basically $50 to $400. So they've backed up a little bit. So all these Adam Warlock books have basically followed the same pattern. A little bit of an I'll be back. Get away from casting news. There's a lull, less people focused on it. We're still away from the movie, despite news that they've kind of wrecked. At least initial shooting. I don't know if they'll have to go back and do any reshoots. But yeah, so we're definitely moving toward Guardians, but still a ways out. One more Adam Warlock book on this list. That is Warlock and the Infinity Watch #1. This is the first appearance of the Infinity Watch team, which was Warlock, Gamora, Drax, Moondragon, Pip the Troll, and Thanos. Almost all of these characters are kind of in the MCU at this point, except for Moondragon. Back then, suspect that maybe we see something like this. Raw copies were up to $15. 9.8 was at $150. Seems like a bit of a stretch that we would get this Infinity Watch thing, especially with all the Guardians kind of probably going out and him just coming in. But we'll see. Now raw copies are $5 to $15, 9.8 at $100 to $250. So throughout that same range, slightly higher occasionally, but the vast majority of sales are raw copies. So this is definitely another I'll be back for this particular book. So that's all the Adam Warlock books. There was only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Adam Warlock books on this list this week. And all the MCU books. Our last book this week was another Comic Buzz related book, and that was Saga #1. It hit the list because we got the announcement back then that Saga was returning after its 3.5-year hiatus. In January, we've now seen 3 or 4 issues, I guess, of Saga, maybe just 3 so far. But this announcement caused 9.8s to jump up to 800 plus. Now they're kind of still sitting at that same range of 600 to 900. Raw copies are sitting around 200 to 500. So this one's actually been pretty steady since the announcement and since the book has kind of returned. Sitting in that same range. A bit of an I'll be back in terms of you can do better if you're kind of patient and do a lot of shopping around. But yeah, so that is this week's list. Dominated by MCU and dominated by books that dropped. We had just a couple of books that stayed steady and just one book that actually went up. But yeah, so overall another week. The pattern has continued all through the winter. We have not had a week that has been kind of almost evenly split between up and down and steady since back early in the fall. Last year we had, the crazy movement. The market went crazy. The market correction has continued, and it's particularly continued for some of these hot books of the moment. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time.